Up at his door again, the same glass jar in her hands, a quiet smile on her face. And this time, Daniel Carter had finally had enough. "Oh," he said, leaning against the doorframe with a grin that hid more than it showed. "Oh, if you keep borrowing sugar from me, the whole neighborhood's going to think you've got a reason to keep coming back." She stopped walking. She looked at him, and what she said next, 4 words, quietly, without flinching, turned everything Daniel thought he knew about his own life completely upside down. "Well, if this story already has your attention, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. And let's see just how far this story travels." Now let's go back to where it all began. Carter hadn't cried in 3 years. Not at the funeral, not the night after, when the house sat so still he could hear the refrigerator humming from the bedroom. On the anniversary, when he stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee so long, it went cold in his hand and he didn't even notice. He had learned a long time ago, before the grief, the loss, before everything, that crying didn't fix anything. It just made your chest hurt and your face puffy and your neighbors ask uncomfortable questions through the screen door. So he stopped. He folded everything up the way you fold a flag, carefully, precisely, with both hands, and he put it somewhere deep in the back of himself where he didn't have to look at it too often. Then Daniel Carter did something that felt, at the time, survival. He built a routine. 6 a.m. every morning, without fail. The alarm didn't need to go off anymore because his body had memorized the hour the way old houses memorize their creaks. He was up before the neighborhood stirred, before the first car backed out of the first driveway. The world had a chance to remind him that it kept moving whether he wanted it to or not. Made coffee, 2 scoops, black, no sugar, and he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden while it brewed. The garden was his, not inherited, not planted by someone else. He had dug every inch of that soil himself the summer after Linda died, with his hands and a second-hand trowel and no plan except to be too tired to think by the time the sun went down. What grew there had surprised him. Tomatoes, lavender, a stubborn rosemary bush that refused to die no matter how little he watered it. Like that rosemary bush more than he'd ever admit to anyone. "Morning," he said to it sometimes from the window. He never said it was strange. It was just what he did. The neighbors, for the most part, left him alone. That was the arrangement, unspoken but clearly understood. Daniel was the kind of maid when you drove past but didn't flag you down. The kind of man who shoveled the walkway before you asked but declined the invitation to come in for hot chocolate. A man who showed up when there was a genuine emergency, a fallen tree, mid-basement, a car that wouldn't start in January, and then quietly disappeared again before anyone thought to offer him dinner. He had been a firefighter for 18 years. He knew how to show up. He just didn't always know how to stay. His neighbor on the left, old Gary, used to joke that Daniel was the most helpful ghost he'd ever met. "You see him when something's broken," Gary liked to say to whoever would listen. Then he vanishes before you even have a chance to say thank you. Daniel had heard that joke secondhand from 3 different people and still didn't entirely disagree with it. On his right had been empty for almost a year. It was a Tuesday in early May when the moving truck arrived, but Daniel didn't watch. He'd learned not to watch new neighbors move in because watching meant curiosity, and curiosity meant conversation, and conversation meant someone eventually asking questions he didn't particularly want to answer. "Are you married? Do you have kids? What do you do with yourself out here all alone?" Already knew the answers. He just preferred not to say them out loud. So he stayed inside. He worked on the fence along the back of the property that had been leaning about 15 degrees since February. He didn't go out front. He didn't look through the window. He gave the new neighbor their space and fully expected them to give him his. That plan lasted exactly 4 days. It was a Thursday evening, and Daniel was on his porch with his coffee second cup, which he allowed himself as a small indulgence on days when he'd been productive, when he heard a knock at his door. The door directly. He stood up slowly, because he was old. 42 wasn't old, he told himself regularly, but because he wasn't expecting anyone. and his body had learned to be cautious about the unexpected. When he opened the door, a woman was standing on his porch. She was maybe mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, a little messy in a way that suggested she'd been working rather than styling it. She was holding a small glass jar, the kind you might use for jam, fireflies, or something in between, and she had the expression of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say approximately 12 times and now couldn't remember any of it. "Hi," she said. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Emily. Well, I just moved in." She gestured sideways toward the house on his right. "I'm making dinner and I ran out of sugar." I know this is a very cliche thing to ask. I actually thought about whether I should Google it and just go to the store instead. But the store's 15 minutes away and the onions are already in the pan, and she stopped herself. "I'm rambling. Could I borrow some sugar?" Daniel looked at her for a moment. "Sure," he said. She exhaled. He got the sugar. She thanked him twice. They're actually in the span of about 20 seconds, and she left. That was it. He went back to his porch, finished his coffee, watched the light go out of the sky, and didn't think about it again. At least he tried not to. She came back 6 days later. Third evening. Same glass jar. This time, she needed a flathead screwdriver because the one she had was the wrong size, and she was trying to replace a light switch cover in the hallway. She watched 2 YouTube tutorials, and she was confident she could handle it, but she needed the right tool. Gave her the screwdriver. She returned it an hour later with a note tucked under the handle that said, "Parked. Thank you, Emily." He left the note on the counter. He didn't ask himself why. The third visit was 9 days after the second, but she knocked at 8 in the evening, which was slightly later than before. She was wearing paint-stained jeans, and there was a small streak of what looked like primer on her left forearm. "Sugar again? Sugar again?" Daniel asked, and he wasn't sure if he was teasing or genuinely asking. "They're out again." She confirmed, a small, self-conscious laugh. "I don't know why I keep running out of it. I'm not even baking anything." "You could just buy an extra bag," Daniel said. Unkindly. "I know," she said. "That's the logical solution." "You're right." She paused. "But then I wouldn't have a reason to bother you." It was the kind of thing people said without thinking. A joke meant to fill the silence, and she clearly heard it land differently than she'd intended because she turned slightly pink and looked down at the jar. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly. "I just meant you've been very nice. Up times. And I don't know anyone here yet, and I know what you meant," Daniel said. He got the sugar. He gave her a little more than she asked for this time. A fourth visit, Daniel had started to notice things. Not big things, small things. The kind of things you only catch when you've been paying attention without meaning to. Remy always knocked at a time when she clearly wasn't in the middle of something urgent. The onion story from the first night had made sense. Dinner, moment of need, a reasonable explanation. But the visits after that came with increasingly approximate excuses. She needed 2 screwdriver, and then she brought it back herself when she could have just left it on the porch. She needed sugar, but she never came during the day when a quick trip to the store would have been entirely reasonable. She came in the evenings, always in the evenings, and she always stayed on the porch for just a few minutes longer than the errand required. Not long, not obviously, just a little longer, long enough for a sentence or two that weren't about screwdrivers or sugar, long enough to ask how his day had been, long enough to mention something she'd noticed, a bird that kept sitting on her chimney, a news story she'd heard on the radio, something small and specific that only mattered if someone was paying attention to the texture of ordinary days. Trump told himself he hadn't noticed. He had absolutely noticed. The visit was a Saturday afternoon, which was unusual enough that Daniel actually looked up from his garden when he heard the gate. Emily walked up the path, looking slightly flustered, just holding the jar, of course, but she was also carrying a cardboard box that looked heavy and awkward, and she was navigating both with the determined expression of a woman who had made a decision and was committed to it, even though her arms were clearly protesting. "Can I set this down for a second?" she asked. "Sure," Daniel said, hung up and brushing soil off his knees. "What is that?" "Books," she said, pouring the box with a grateful grunt. I'm reorganizing the second bedroom, and I have too many. I put some in the front closet, but the shelf in there is loose, and I don't want the whole thing to fall." And she shook her head. Remember, I should have asked before I carried this all the way over. "Would you have a drill and maybe some wall anchors?" "I have both," Daniel said. Yes. He looked at the box of books. He looked at her. "I'll just bring it over," he said. "It'll be easier." Emily blinked. "You don't have to. The shelf will take 5 minutes," he said. "The box is heavy. Let's just go." It took 40 minutes, not 5, because the wall was older than either of them had anticipated, and the studs were not where logic suggested they should be. But by the end of it, the shelf was solid enough to hold an encyclopedia set. Emily made them both tea, while Daniel repacked his tools. They stood in her kitchen the first time he'd been inside her house, and she said, "You really didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "Thank you. Don't mention it." There was a pause. "I'm going to mention it," she said. "It was genuinely nice. Our people aren't that generous usually." Daniel looked at her. "Where'd you come from before here?" "Seattle," she said. "Corporate marketing. 12-hour days. 43rd floor. Whole thing. That sounds exhausting." "It was," she said simply. "Baltus." And something in the way she said it, not dramatically, but with a rehearsed story ready to follow, made Daniel believe her completely. He went home that evening and sat on the porch longer than usual. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel like relief and lately had started to feel like something else, not quite loneliness. Because Daniel didn't allow himself to call it that, the particular weight of a silence that has no one in it. What about the books in the box? He'd noticed the titles while he anchored the shelf. There's a few novels, a worn copy of something called The Warmth of Other Suns that had so many dog-eared pages it looked like it had been read multiple times. Poetry collection with what looked like pencil notes in the margins. About it. He hadn't asked about the notes. He'd thought about it. But he hadn't asked. The 6th visit came on a Wednesday evening. "Sugar?" Daniel asked before she could speak. "Sugar," Emily confirmed. "You've run out again." "I have." He looked at her for a moment. I have a whole bag. You could just take it. All of it. That way you'd have enough for a while." She smiled. But it was a very particular smile, the kind that meant something was almost funny, but also wasn't quite. Only need a little," she said. Daniel went inside. Out of the jar. He brought it back, and just before she turned to go, he said it not planned, out, "Emily, that company you can just knock. You don't need the jar." She froze. Just for a second, maybe half a second, a fraction of a pause that someone not paying attention would have missed entirely. Then she turned back and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between surprised and relieved, and just a little bit caught. She said quietly. She held up the jar. "But this feels safer." And then she walked back across the yard, where Daniel stood in his doorway, watching her go. And something shifted in the back of his chest, not dramatically. Not in the way you described to someone else later. The way the temperature shifts just before rain. And real, and impossible to ignore. He told himself he was imagining things. A talent for that, for convincing himself that what he felt was something smaller and more manageable than what it actually was. 3 years of practice will do that to a person. You get good at shrinking things, at finding reasonable explanations for unreasonable feelings. She's just a lonely person in a new place. You know what that's like. You don't need to make it into something it isn't. Heard the rosemary bush the next morning and didn't say anything to it about what she'd said. This feels safer. Safer than what? Safer than knocking without a reason? Safer than admitting she wanted to talk to someone. Safer than what? He understood, he realized. That was the uncomfortable part. He understood exactly what she meant, not because he'd asked her to explain it, and not because she'd said anything more, but because he had been doing the same thing for 3 years in the opposite direction. He hadn't borrowed sugar. He'd borrowed distance. He had wrapped himself in routines and early mornings and solitary gardening, and the reputation of being the helpful ghost, the man who shows up and then disappears, and told himself it was a preference. Personality, just the way he was built, but preferences don't hurt. Particular silence of a house with no one in it hurt in a way he'd gotten so used to that he'd almost stopped feeling it. Almost. The seventh visit happened 9 days later. By now, Daniel had started to keep track, without entirely meaning to, the rhythm of it. She came every 6 to 10 days, always the glass jar, always in the evening, always a plausible excuse that got slightly less convincing each time. She needed an egg. An egg, Daniel said. There's one, she confirmed. I'm making something. What are you making? A thing, she said. Recipe. From online, it needs an egg. He gave her the egg. She turned it carefully in both hands. How are you? She asked. It was such a simple question. People asked it 40 times a day without meaning it. Emily asked it standing on his porch with an egg in her hands. Looking at him directly, she meant it. Daniel felt the back of his throat tighten slightly. Fine, he said. Yeah. She nodded slowly. You don't have to say that, you know. To me, you can just say whatever's actually true. He looked at her. Makes you think something's not true. She tilted her head. Because you say, I'm fine, the way I used to say, I'm busy. Like it's an answer designed to stop the conversation before it starts. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. That was the surprising part. It should have been uncomfortable. Of observation that, from most people, that would have made Daniel take a small step back and change the subject. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe. I am fine, he said. More slowly this time. Just quiet. Quiet's okay, Emily said. Well, he agreed. Until it isn't. She looked at him. Yeah, she said softly. Until it isn't. She left. He stood in the doorway until the light in her kitchen came on. The eighth visit was different. She didn't bring the jar. She knocked on a Thursday evening, and when Daniel opened the door, her hands were empty, their corners, and she looked for just a moment before she pulled it back together like she'd been crying recently. Dramatically, just in the quiet, private way that leaves small traces. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. I don't need anything, she said. I was inside, and it was very quiet, and I just wanted to. She stopped herself. Her head. This is weird, isn't it? Just knocking with no reason? Daniel opened the door wider. I was going to have coffee, he said. She blinked. I don't drink coffee, she said. I have tea, he said. Okay, she said. They sat on the porch. She had the tea. He had the coffee. The evening settled around them the way evenings do in late spring, the light going golden and long, Trevor's dog barking once and then going quiet, a particular smell of cut grass from somewhere 2 streets over. About anything dramatic. She mentioned a TV show she'd been watching that turned out to be terrible, but somehow she'd watched all of it anyway because she needed to know how it ended. But he mentioned the rosemary bush. He wasn't sure why. Just came out. You talked to it? She asked. He paused. And good morning to it once. Once? Another pause. It's happened more than once. Emily laughed. A real one, not polite, not performative, just genuinely amused. It was the kind of laugh that surprised her a little, like she hadn't expected to do it. Daniel found that he was smiling before he'd decided to. It had been a while since that happened. They stayed out until the sky went fully dark. It wasn't planned. Neither of them mentioned the time. They just kept talking about nothing in particular and somehow about everything that mattered. And when Emily finally said I should go, reluctantly, the way you say something you know is true, but wish wasn't. Thank you, she said, standing. For what? Daniel asked. We just sat here. Yeah, exactly. She went home. On the porch, alone, for another 10 minutes. Then he picked up both mugs and went inside. The house felt different when he walked in. Bigger, not louder, but somehow less empty than when he'd left it. He stood in the kitchen and tried to name the feeling. He couldn't find a word for it exactly. But he knew it had been a very long time since he'd felt it. About Linda. He always thought about Linda, in some low and constant way. The way you're always aware of a healed break, even after it stops hurting. Tonight he thought about her, specifically, about a conversation they'd had once years ago, or everything when she'd told him that the hardest thing about loving someone was how much of yourself you had to be willing to risk. He'd said something dismissive, the way you do when you're young and lucky and don't understand yet how right a person can be. about something. Or she'd laughed and said, "You'll understand someday." Or, "The door has to be open from the inside." He hadn't thought about that in a long time. About it now. The ninth visit was a Saturday morning, the first time she'd ever come during the day. She knocked just after 9, and Daniel answered the door in his work jeans with coffee already in hand. Emily was holding a plate. He stared at it. It was something baked, dusted with powdered sugar. "I made scones," she said. "You didn't bake," he said. "I learned," she said simply. At the plate, then at her, then at the plate again. "With whose sugar?" he asked. The look on her face caught, amused, flustered, and trying not to be any of those things simultaneously was, without question, the funniest thing Daniel had seen in months. "A bag," she admitted. "A full bag. A full bag. So you have sugar. I have sugar." He stepped back from the doorway. "Better come in, then," he said. They ate the scones at his kitchen table. Ours, they were, honestly, pretty good, not perfect. A little too dense on one side. That was the honest kind of baking that meant someone had actually made it themselves. But Emily admitted it was her third attempt. She'd thrown away the first batch entirely. The second had been structurally sound but tasted like regret. Daniel repeated. "I added too much baking soda," she said. "That particular I don't know. That chemical taste, that makes you question your choices." He laughed. Actually laughed. Not just a polite sound, but the real thing. And Emily looked at him when he did, startled, like she'd unexpectedly won something she hadn't known she was competing for. "A good laugh," she said, without thinking. Laughing, she looked away. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "A beat. It's been a while since anyone told me that," he said. The morning stretched longer than either of them planned. These became a conversation about food, and food became a conversation about places they'd both been and things they'd eaten there. And somewhere in the middle of that, she mentioned a trip she'd taken alone, just herself. A flight, a week in a city where she didn't know anyone, and the way she said alone had weight to it. Regret, exactly. Just the particular kind of freedom that comes with knowing no one is waiting for you, and the particular ache that comes with the same fact. "Why'd you leave Seattle?" he asked, genuinely. She was quiet for a moment. "Because I was very good at my job," she said. "And being very good at my job was the only interesting thing about me." And one day I realized. She paused, looked at her coffee cup. "I was 45 minutes from being fired, or 45 minutes from being promoted to a bigger version of the same thing. But neither one scared me. And that scared me." Daniel thought about that. "What'd scare you?" he asked. She looked up. "Realizing I couldn't remember the last time I laughed," she said. "Throw one, like you just did." The words sat between them, quiet and honest and a little bit fragile. "I know that feeling," Daniel said finally. "Soupy." "What happened?" she asked, gently. Not pressing, just asking. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Rob died," he said, 3 years ago. In March. Emily didn't say "I'm so sorry" right away, which he appreciated. People always said it right away, reflexively, like a verbal flinch. She sat with it for a second first. "What was her name?" she asked. "Linda." "What was she like?" He thought about it. "She was the loudest person in any room she walked into," he said. "Just because she was obnoxious. Just because everything she felt out loud. She didn't do quiet very well." "And you do," Emily said. He agreed. "I think she probably balanced you out." He looked up. "The same thing," he said. Constantly. A small smile crossed Emily's face. "That woman," she said. She left at nearly noon. Daniel walked her to the door, which he hadn't done before. It wasn't that far. It was his own front door, but somehow it felt like a thing to do. "Same time next Saturday," she said, on the porch, half joking. "I'll have tea ready," he said, not joking at all. She left. He stood in the doorway until she went inside. And somewhere deep in the back of himself, past the carefully folded grief and the practice routines and the 3 years of comfortable distance, something had started slowly, quietly, to open. He didn't name it. He wasn't ready to name it, but he knew the way you know things that your logic hasn't caught up with yet, that the glass jar on the counter was no longer just a jar. And the woman who kept bringing it back was no longer just a neighbor. He didn't know yet what neither of them knew, was that the neighborhood had already started to notice. And what people notice, they talk about. And what people talk about eventually get wrong. And getting it wrong, in this particular case, cost both of them more than either of them was prepared to pay. Saturday after the scones, Emily came back, not with the jar, but with an excuse. She knocked at 10 in the morning, holding a folded piece of paper, and said, "A crack in the back wall of the house, and I don't know if it's serious or if I'm panicking over nothing." To look at it, Daniel looked at her, then at the paper, which turned out to be a printout of an article titled "7 Signs Your Foundation is Failing," with 3 items circled in red marker. He printed it out, he said. "I needed to circle things," she said, put on his jacket and went. The crack was not serious, but the kind of settling that happened in houses that age, normal and fixable, and absolutely not the structural catastrophe the article had implied. Daniel told her this, standing in her backyard, and Emily stood beside him and listened carefully, and then let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since she'd found it. "Thank goodness," she said. "You had the whole foundation collapsing in your head, didn't you?" he said. "I had us both standing in rubble by Thursday," she admitted. "Us both." She said it without thinking, the way people say things when they've already stopped editing themselves around you. Neville noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. He went home an hour later and she thanked him in the doorway. And he walked back across the yard feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Useful. Not in the way firefighters are useful urgently, for a crisis, and then released, but in the smaller, ordinary way. The way that means someone thought of you first. He didn't sleep well that night, not because anything was wrong, because his mind wouldn't quiet down, and that was new. 3 years of dreamless, efficient sleep. And now this. He blamed the scones. It was easier. The weeks after that moved in a rhythm that Daniel hadn't planned and didn't examine too closely, because examining it felt like something he wasn't ready to do. He came by, he went over. They fixed things, they talked, drank coffee or tea on whichever porch the conversation had migrated to. The jar appeared less frequently now, not because Emily had stopped coming, but because the jar was no longer necessary. She knocked on his door without it sometimes. On hers, the excuse had quietly retired, and neither of them acknowledged its absence, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging what had replaced it. What had replaced it was something neither of them had a clean, comfortable word for. It was a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the foundation scare, when Emily said something that stopped Daniel cold. They were in her kitchen. She'd bought a proper toolkit by then, a real one, not the mismatched collection of inherited hardware she'd started with, and Daniel was showing her how to patch the gap around the kitchen window frame where cold air had been getting in. He was explaining the technique. She was watching with the focused attention she gave to anything she'd decided to learn. And then completely out of nowhere, she said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't knocked that first night?" Daniel kept his hand on the caulk gun. "Where'd that come from?" he asked. "I was thinking about it today," she said. "Almost didn't. I stood in my kitchen with the jar for probably 10 minutes arguing with myself. He's going to think this is ridiculous. One woman at 42 can figure out how to get her own sugar." 35, Daniel said. She blinked. "What? You told me you were 35 when you moved in." She stared at him. "Remember that?" she said slowly. "You mentioned it," he said, and went back to the window and was very focused on the window frame for the next several seconds. Emily was quiet, and then very quietly, "You pay attention, I'm observant," he said. "Requirement, 20 years. You've been retired for how long? 4 years. So it wasn't the job." He didn't answer that. Third, he finished the window frame and cleaned the excess with the edge of a cloth and stepped back to check the line. "Looks good," Emily said, still watching him. "It'll hold through winter," he said. "Here's Daniel," he turned. She was looking at him with that expression again, the one he'd started to catalog without meaning to. And a little bit searching, like she was trying to read something written in a language she mostly knew. "I knocked," she said. He held her gaze. "Me too," he said. He went home. 20 minutes later, he stood in his kitchen. At the jar on the shelf, the glass one she'd left behind a few visits ago and never reclaimed. He left it where it was. The next week, Gary from next door flagged Daniel down when he was taking out the recycling. He was 71, a retired postal worker who had lived on the street since before Daniel moved in, some kind of man who delivered information, the cheerful efficiency of someone who genuinely did not understand that not everyone wanted it. There, that new neighbor of yours, Gary said, nodding toward Emily's house. Nice woman, she waved to you often. We're friends, Daniel said. Friends, Gary repeated, in exactly the tone that meant he had opinions about that word choice. Well, she just moved here, Daniel said. She doesn't know many people. Sure, Gary said. And then, just friendly, I guess. Just friendly, Daniel confirmed. Nodded sagely, which was somehow more irritating than if he'd just said what he was thinking. Daniel took his recycling in and did not think about the conversation, or tried not to. The thing about living somewhere long enough is that your business becomes, gradually and incrementally, everyone else's business too. Not through any malicious process, just through proximity, through the natural human tendency to notice patterns, through the fact that when you live 30 feet from someone you can observe, trying approximately 40% of their visible life. The neighbors had noticed Emily's visits. This was, in hindsight, inevitable. What Daniel hadn't anticipated was how quickly noticing became narrating. I became aware of it slowly, through small things. I was in conversation when he mentioned Emily's name at the hardware store, where he ran into a couple from 3 streets over. Exchanged between 2 women at the community mailboxes when he and Emily happened to both arrive at the same time. And she laughed at something he said. The way Gary's wife, Dot, had started smiling at him with a particular warmth when she passed him on the sidewalk, the kind of warm smile that implied she knew something and was very pleased about it. Daniel said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. Emily noticed too. She mentioned it one evening carefully, like she was handing him something fragile. I think the neighborhood has theories about us, she said, on her back porch, which had become their default location in the evenings because the light was better and there was a bird that had taken to sitting in the tree at the fence line, and Emily had named it Gerald, even though agreed it was almost certainly a female. Whereabouts, Gerald's back, Daniel said, looking at the tree. Don't change the subject. I'm not. You absolutely are. He looked at her. Of theories? He asked. The kind that involve people smiling at me at the mailbox, she said. I actually don't mind the smiling. It's the particular quality of the smiling. They know something. People like stories, Daniel said, especially in neighborhoods like this. What's the story they think they know? Emily asked. Quiet for a moment. Probably the obvious one, he said. Her. She looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at something in the tree above her. That's so bad? Emily asked. And her voice was very neutral and very careful. Hey, voices get when they're carrying more than they're letting on. He turned his coffee cup in his. This was a thing he did when he was thinking his way through something carefully. Emily had noticed it weeks ago. No, he said, one word. Just that. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. When he left that night, he caught himself thinking about the conversation all the way home, and for a long time after. Remember turning it over the way you turn something in your hands to feel its weight. He said no. It's not bad the way he meant this is fine. You're being silly. He'd said it the way you say something when you've realized, or in the act of answering, that the answer has weight and implications, and you're not sure yet what to do with either. Oh, it wasn't bad. The question was what it was instead. 2 weeks later, Emily found something she hadn't expected to find. She'd been going through the storage room at the back of the house, the one that came with the property, and contained the previous owner's idea of organization, which was to put everything into cardboard boxes and label none of them. And in the third box she opened, found a photograph. It wasn't hers. It had been left behind, probably fallen out of something, probably forgotten. It showed a man and a woman standing in a garden, laughing, his head tilted back with the full body kind of laugh that meant something genuinely funny had happened. The man looking at her with an expression that was partly amusement and partly something much quieter and more private. Emily sat with the photograph for a moment. She didn't know these people. They were strangers from a life she'd walked into secondhand when she bought the house. Yes. But the expression on the man's face, the way he was looking at her, at the camera, at her, she'd seen something like it recently. She set the photograph aside and went back to sorting boxes. About it for the rest of the afternoon. Not about it that evening, when Daniel came by to help her move a piece of furniture she'd ordered online that was heavier than the shipping description suggested. About it while they argued amiably about the best angle of approach for getting a bookcase through a narrow hallway. About it, and she thought about it while they celebrated the successful navigation with tea and the last 2 cookies from a bag bought 3 days ago. He looks at things the way that man in the photograph looked at the woman. With the particular attention of someone who has decided, quietly and without announcement, that what they're looking at matters. Yes. She didn't say any of this. She was getting better at knowing which thoughts to keep. But later that night, sitting in her own kitchen, she admitted to herself slowly, with the careful honesty of someone who has been burned by her own impatience, for that she was not borrowing sugar anymore. Oh, she hadn't been borrowing sugar for a long time. She was borrowing something else, something that didn't have a clean name yet, something that felt privacy of her own chest at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, a great deal like the beginning of something she hadn't planned for. And that terrified her, because Emily Parker had planned for everything. That was what she did. She planned and she executed and she measured results and she adjusted and she was excellent at all of it. She had planned her career. She had planned her exit from her career. She had planned the house, the renovation, the new start. Planned for a quiet man with a rosemary bush and a very good laugh and 20 years of firefighting behind him, who remembered she was 35 and fixed her window frames on a Wednesday evening without asking for anything in return. The photograph of the strangers in a shoebox and put it on the shelf in the storage room. Told herself she was fine. She was, in fact, not entirely fine. Following Saturday, Daniel did something he hadn't done in 3 years. His sister, Rachel, was 50, a physical therapist in Boise, a person who had given up on subtlety sometime around her 40th birthday and hadn't missed it since. She and Daniel talked regularly in the loose, approximate way of siblings who love each other and have very different lives every 2 or 3 weeks, about practical things, his garden, her kid, the general state of the world. He called her on a Saturday afternoon, which was unusual, and she answered on the second ring and said, "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he said. "Calling on a Saturday. I call on Saturdays." "You call on Thursdays," she said. "Sundays. Never Saturdays." "What happened?" "Nothing happened," he said. "And I met someone." The silence on Rachel's end lasted approximately 4 seconds. "I need you to say that again," she said. "I didn't mean it like she's my neighbor." "Friends." "Okay," Rachel said, in the tone that meant she was being very patient. "She moved in a few months ago. She's been through a lot." We've been spending time together." "Tell me about her," Rachel said. Daniel did. He didn't mean to say as much as he said, because he wanted to talk to someone, not to give a full account. Rachel was good at listening in the way that made you keep going. And he found himself describing Emily in more detail than he'd intended. The jar, phones, the foundation article, Gerald the bird, conversation on the porch about what would have happened if she hadn't knocked. They finished. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Daniel," she said. He said, "I'm not doing anything. You have a voice." "I have a voice?" "You have a voice you use when you're about to say something I already know." Rachel laughed. "Fine. Then you already know what I'm going to say." "I do," he said. He was quiet. "And it's scary," he said. "Of course it's scary," Rachel said. "It was always going to be scary." "That's not a reason." "I know." "Linda would I know," he said. More firmly, not harshly, just firmly, the way you close a door that you're not ready to open. Or let it go. "Is she good to you?" she asked instead. About the photograph on the shelf that wasn't hers. About the way she asked, what was she like, before she said, "I'm sorry." About you pay attention, and the scones And the fact that she'd learned to bake them because she wanted to bring him something. Yeah, he said, she is. Then stop talking to me about it, Rachel said cheerfully. "Oh, and go figure it out." He laughed. "You're impossible," he said. "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He hung up with the phone in his hand for a while. Then he put it down and looked out at the garden. And there, the rosemary bush was doing aggressively well for mid-autumn. Oh, he'd started talking to it again without thinking about it. There, and he hadn't decided whether that was a good sign or just a habit. The door has to open from the inside. He thought it was right. She was almost always right. He thought being afraid of something and knowing you want it anyway is the most human thing there is. He went back inside and made dinner. And that evening he sat on the porch and waited without exactly knowing he was waiting. At 7:15, Emily's porch light came on and her door opened, and she came out and stood there for a moment, and then she saw him. She raised a hand. He raised one back. "Long day?" he called. "Today," she confirmed. "Tea?" he asked. She crossed the yard. That was all. That was the whole of it. She crossed the yard and sat on his porch, and they talked until the colder air drove them inside. And nothing dramatic happened, and no declarations were made. By every external measure, it was simply as another evening between two people who had become much ceremony important to each other. But Daniel felt it differently now. The phone call, after saying it out loud, after hearing his own voice describe her to someone who loved him, he felt it with a new and slightly terrifying clarity. He was not just helping a neighbor. He was not just being kind. He was quietly and entirely against the plan he'd made for his own remaining years. And the terrifying part, the part that kept him awake that night in the good way, the way that means something, was that he didn't want to stop. Earnings later, Emily was at his door at 9 with the glass jar in her hand. He hadn't seen the jar in weeks. It now felt like seeing an old joke resurface, affectionate, there, and this time pointed. "You're not out of sugar," he said. "Isn't a question. I have a full bag," she confirmed. "What do you need?" She looked at him. She looked down at the jar, looked back at him. "I don't know," she said. I wanted to come over." And this felt like the honest version. He stared at her. "Honest version," he repeated. "Of the excuse," she said. "I'm not pretending I need anything. I'm just holding the jar because I don't know. It means something now. To me. It's the thing that started everything." She shook her head. "I realize this is possibly the strangest thing I've said to you. And I've said some strange things." Daniel looked at the jar in her hands. Turning light was on it, catching the glass, and it was just a jar, simple and old and entirely ordinary. And it was also somehow the most specific object he'd ever seen. "Come in," he said. She came in. They sat at the kitchen table. He poured coffee. She had tea. The jar sat between them on the table, and neither of them moved it. "I moved here," Emily said, made a list of things I was going to do differently. She wrapped both hands around her mug. I was going to be independent, not in a cold way, in a strong way. I was going to prove to myself that I didn't need anything from anyone, that I couldn't go out and get myself. "And then your onions were in the pan," Daniel said. Smiled. "And then my onions were in the pan," she said. "Well, and you opened the door. And you weren't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know." "Someone who'd hand me the sugar and close the door. Someone who was just a neighbor." She paused. "You were just a neighbor who somehow never made me feel like that's all I was." Something shifted in Daniel's chest. A particular shift he'd been trying not to name. "I have a confession," he said. She looked at him. "After your second visit, I started counting," he said. "Your visits. Without meaning to. I noticed when they happened. How long you stayed. What you brought." He looked at the jar. Myself, I was just observant. Old habit. She was very still. She asked quietly. He shook his head. He said, "God." The kitchen was quiet. The jar sat between them, catching the light. He said, "I'm afraid." "Of what?" he asked. "Of wanting something this much and being wrong about it," she said. "I've been wrong before, about what I thought I needed, who I thought I was building a life with." She looked at her hands. "I left a whole life behind because I'd built it on things that looked right but weren't. And then I moved here and I knocked on your door with a stupid jar and you." She stopped. "Ours. You made me feel like I'd gotten something right. That's terrifying because what if I'm just lonely and mistaking it?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, long enough that she looked up. "When Linda died," he said, slowly choosing each word the way you choose a careful step, "I decided the safest thing was to not want much. If you don't want much, you don't lose much. If you don't let anyone in, no one can leave." He looked at her. "I was very good at it. For 3 years, I was excellent at it. Sure. And then you came to my door with a jar you didn't need for sugar you didn't use, and talked to me on my porch for 4 minutes about onions. And something happened that I didn't plan for." "What happened?" she asked. "They're looking forward to the next time," she said. Silence after that was not empty. It was full of everything they'd been circling for months, every conversation that had stopped just short of this one, every careful detour around the obvious thing, and now the obvious thing was on the table between them, right next to the jar, and there it was. Emily's eyes were bright in a way that wasn't quite tears but was adjacent. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't want to rush it. I know. I needed you to know that the jar isn't about sugar," she said. It was never about the sugar. It was about," she gestured, a small helpless motion at the space between them. "I know," Daniel said for the third time. "I've known for a while," she exhaled. He reached across the table and picked up the jar and turned it once in his hands and set it back down. "Got it," he said. She looked at him. "The jar," he said. "Sure. Keep it. It means something. You should have it." She picked it up with both hands, held it for a long moment. "Okay," she said softly. That was the beginning of the real thing. Not dramatic, announced. Just two people sitting at a kitchen table in the morning light, finally saying what had been true for a long time. Their brothers. But in the neighborhood outside that kitchen window, in the houses up and down the street, a different story was forming. They built on observations without context, on assumptions dressed as concern, on the very human habit of taking two quiet people and writing a louder version of their lives. And that story, the neighborhood story, the one they would tell at the next community, gathering with nods and lowered voices, was already on its way toward Emily. She just didn't know it yet. The jar sat on Emily's kitchen windowsill now, on the corners. She hadn't planned to display it. He'd set it there one morning while she was unpacking groceries, meaning to put it somewhere else, and then she didn't move it. And then a week passed, and she still didn't move it. Somewhere in that week it stopped being an object she meant to relocate and became an object that belonged exactly where it was. I noticed it through her window one evening when he came over to help her replace a cabinet hinge that had given out. He didn't say anything about it, but he saw it, and she saw him see it, and neither of them mentioned it, and that felt like its own kind of conversation. Things between them had shifted not dramatically, with any announcement, but in the specific molecular way that things shift when two people have said something true to each other and can't quite go back to the careful distance that came before. More. They talked longer. The evenings on the porch had started to stretch past 9, past 10 sometimes, until the cold air drove them inside, and they moved the conversation indoors without discussing it, deciding, just moving naturally toward the warmer room, the way water moves toward lower ground. Daniel started bringing her tomatoes from the garden, not presented, just left on her porch, step in a small paper bag in the morning when he walked past, the way you do something when you want to do it, but don't want to make a production of it. Emily started leaving things on his step too. A paperback she'd finished and thought he might like, a container of leftover soup with a sticky note on the lid that said things like "made too much," argue, and "yes, I know you can cook for yourself. Just eat it." He ate it. Both times. He left the containers on her step with their own notes. The first said, "Good soup." The second said, "Better than the scones," and he could hear her laughing through the wall, through the side of the house that adjoined the neighboring yard, that arrived muffled and real and somehow entirely clear. What was the texture of it? The accumulated small ordinary weight of two people building a habit out of each other, naming it, without rushing it, in the exact way that Emily had said she needed and that Daniel had never quite done before, even with Linda, who had named everything immediately and loudly and with enormous confidence and been right about all of it. This was quieter, and quieter suited him. He was fine. It felt like something he'd grown into, something that fit the current version of himself in a way the louder versions of things no longer did. He was careful with this thought. He didn't want to compare. Linda and Emily were not in competition, had never been in competition, existed in entirely different chambers of his life, understood this with full clarity. But the understanding didn't stop him from noticing the difference, and the difference was that he was 42 years old and 3 years out of the worst thing that had ever happened to him. The person crossing his yard with leftover soup on a Tuesday evening was exactly the right kind of person at exactly this particular moment in his life. He thought that was probably what second chances felt like if you were lucky enough to get one. He thought that, and then he pushed it aside because naming it too clearly felt like touching something hot, and he'd learned to be careful with heat. The community gathering was Dot's idea. Gary's wife, the woman with the particular warm smile, organized a neighborhood potluck every autumn. She had done it for years, a tradition she maintained with the cheerful iron will of someone who understood that communities needed maintenance the same way houses did, that you couldn't just leave people alone in their separate properties and expect them to feel like neighbors. The gathering was always at the end of October. In the community center 2 streets over, it was the kind of event that Daniel attended reliably and left early as showing up felt like the right thing and staying felt like too much. Emily was invited. "You should come," Daniel told her a week before. "I wasn't planning to," she said. "I don't really know anyone." "You know me," he said. She looked at him. "Will you stay past 8:30 this time?" He raised an eyebrow. "You know I leave at 8:30. "Gary told me," she said simply. "He tells everyone everything," Daniel said. "He does," Emily agreed. "Also told me that you brought a casserole last year that people are still talking about. It was a good casserole." He said, "You left before dessert." Daniel looked away. "Like dessert. You ate 3 of my scones. Those were different." How, he didn't answer. She let him not answer. She was getting good at knowing which silences to fill and which ones to leave. "To the gathering," he said again. "You should meet people. Live here now." "Okay," she said after a moment. "You have to stay past 8:30. I make no guarantees." "Daniel." "I'll stay," he said. "Past 8:30. I'll stay." She smiled. He went home and told himself he wasn't looking forward to it any more than he would have otherwise. This was not true. The evening of the gathering arrived on a Saturday, and they walked over together, which was practical. They were going to the same place. It made no sense to drive separately, but which also felt, in the particular way that things between them kept feeling like slightly more than just practical. The community center was warm and full when they arrived. Full of food, the particular mix of familiar faces, and people Daniel could only place with effort, overlapping noise of a crowd in a small space. And he stayed close at first, not clinging, just orienting the way you do in a room where you don't know the geography, and Daniel introduced her to the people he knew, which turned out to be more people than he'd expected. It turned out that 3 years of being the helpful ghost had left more goodwill than he'd realized. As Emily, he said to Dot, to Gary, to the couple from around the corner with the twins, to the woman who ran the corner cafe, who Daniel bought his coffee from 3 times a week. She moved in next to me in May. People were warm. Emily was gracious and easy and funny in the precise way that people who have spent years in professional environments are funny quick, observational, self-deprecating, in a way that made people like her immediately. I watched her work the room, the way you watch someone do something they're excellent at, with specific pleasure of knowing a side of the person no one else there had seen. Or into the gathering, they split naturally, Daniel to the food table, there a conversation with Dot that had apparently become very engaging, and Daniel stood with a plate of food he was actually eating and thought, clarity that surprised him, "I'm glad she's here." Not glad in the abstract, glad specifically. glad in the way that meant something. Up in the thought that he almost didn't notice the conversation happening 2 feet to his left. There's two women he knew, slightly neighbors from the far end of the street, people who waved but didn't stop, were talking in the lowered voice that people use at party when they want to discuss something, but are at least nominally aware that other people are nearby. Over there, constantly, one of them was saying, the other day, practically, "I know," said the other. "I've seen it, and he's over at her place just as often. I don't want to assume anything. It's just she moved here alone, and she immediately starts spending all her time at the house next door. I heard she'd had a hard time," the first one said, with a particular tone that made hard time sound like a diagnosis. "Career collapse, I think. Or a relationship, I'm not sure. Or he mentioned something." "Poor thing," the second one said, in a voice that does not entirely mean poor thing. "It's just he's a widower. He's been alone a long time. And she seems to need a lot. A lot of help," the first agreed. "Of something," the second said. Daniel set down his plate. He didn't say anything. He moved away from that end of the table and stood somewhere else and looked across the room to where Emily was still talking with Dot and two other women, laughing at something completely unaware. The comments weren't cruel. That was the thing. They weren't malicious. They were the ordinary, low-grade, entirely human version of unkindness, the kind that comes from too much proximity and too little information, and the very natural tendency to create a story when you only have the outline. But Daniel knew what those words would do if Emily heard them. He knew because he knew what they would do to him. The implication that she was needy, that she couldn't handle her own life, that what was between them was transactional in some quiet, slightly pathetic way. He knew what those words were made of, and he knew they were wrong, and he felt something sharp and protective rise in him that had nothing to do with being heroic and everything to do with the simple, furious clarity of knowing a person and hearing them misread. He did not go back to the conversation. He did not correct the women. Let go, the way you let things go that aren't worth the cost of the fight. And he found Emily 20 minutes later and stayed close for the rest of the evening and said nothing about what he'd heard. Stayed past 8:30. He stayed until almost 10. The walk home, he was quieter than usual. Emily noticed. Always noticed. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You're using the word." "Fine," she said. Designed to stop the conversation. He almost smiled despite himself. "Tired," he said. "Good evening." "Just tired." She let him have it. But she looked at him once more before she went inside. Long look that said, "I see you, and you don't have to say anything. I see you." And then she went in, and he went home. He sat in his kitchen for a long time. He thought about the two women's voices, about the word needy, and how completely and profoundly wrong it was as a description of Emily Parker, who had moved here alone and fixed a house largely by herself and built something from nothing in a place where she knew no one, who knocked on his door not because she was incapable, but because she was brave enough to find a reason when a reason was the only way she knew how to ask. And he thought, she's going to hear it, not from those two women, necessarily. But the story was out there now, circling in the low-level social atmosphere of a neighborhood, and Emily was perceptive, and she paid attention, and it was only a matter of time. Himself, he was worried about her. He was worried about her, but he was also, underneath that, worried about something he hadn't quite articulated, even to himself, that whatever was happening between them, and carefully, and in the exact way that felt right, vulnerable to the outside world in ways he hadn't prepared for. The people would look at what they had and flatten it. And that Emily, who carried her own complicated relationship with needing people and being perceived as needing people, might hear the flattened version and believe it. He was right to be worried. He just didn't know how right until it happened. It was 10 days after the gathering. Emily had spent the afternoon at a community event, a library fundraiser, something low-key that she'd signed up for as a way to meet more people, exactly the kind of effort Daniel had quietly encouraged and privately admired. Back in good spirits, texted him a brief account of an extremely long debate between two retirees about the correct way to alphabetize a used book sale, and said she was making dinner if he wanted company. Rod, he'd said yes. But when he arrived, she wasn't herself. The door and she smiled, and she said, "Come in." But the smile was the performed version, the one she was so good at, and she'd spent years perfecting in corporate conference rooms, and not the real one he'd learned to recognize. He asked. "Nothing," she said. "I'm making pasta." "There, sit down." He sat. He watched her at the stove, and he could read the tension in her shoulders the way you learn to read a person when you've been paying attention for long enough. A specific set of her posture that meant she was holding something. He said. "It's fine," she said. "You're using my word," he said. Looked at him. The smile dropped. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned the stove down and leaned against the counter and looked at him directly. "Library today," she said. "One of the women from the gathering mentioned something." Casually, in passing, she paused. "She said it was so nice that I had someone like you to help me settle in. It must be hard, starting over alone, and that you'd clearly been very generous with your time." Daniel was still nicely, Emily continued. Genuinely nicely. That's the thing. She wasn't being cruel, but the way she said it, starting over alone, generous with his time, it was like she pressed her lips together. It was a project, like you'd taken me on. Like what she stopped. "What we have is charity," Daniel said. She looked at him. Close. "Yes," she said. The word landed hard. She turned back to the stove. She stirred the pasta. She didn't say anything for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was carefully level. "The thing is," she said, "I know it's not. I know that's not what it is." Hearing it said out loud, in that particular way, she paused. "I spent 12 years being very good at something and having people assume it was because I had help, or because I was in the right place, or because someone had given me something I didn't earn." She set the spoon down. "And I left that world because I was so tired of being misread. I came here and I built something. I genuinely built something, and now I'm the neighbor who needed you to help her." "You didn't need me to help you," Daniel said. "I know that. You fixed most of this house yourself." "I know. You knocked on my door with a jar of I know." Oh. Her voice cracked slightly, not breaking, just the hairline fracture of someone keeping something in. "I know what it was, but she doesn't. And apparently other people don't either. And she exhaled. "I just don't want to be someone's project." "Not here, not again." Daniel stood up. He walked to the counter, beside her. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. "Are not a project," he said. "You have never been a project. You knocked on my door, and you made me remember that I actually wanted to open it. Do you understand the difference?" She was quiet. "You gave me something," he said. "Not the other way around. You came over with that jar, and you made me feel like the door was worth opening. I was worth talking to. Like my mornings were worth something to someone besides me." He held her gaze. "That's not charity. That's the opposite of charity." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright. "You should have been a better liar," she said softly. "I could have just stayed mad." "I've never been good at lying," he said. "No," she said. "It's very inconvenient." He almost smiled. "Back at the pasta." "Okay," she said, after a moment. "Okay?" he asked. "I'm not spiraling," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud. To you specifically." She picked the spoon back up. "The person I want to say things out loud to." The honesty of that hit him somewhere clean and direct. The way honest things do when they're not dressed up. She nodded. He went back to the table. Finished the pasta. They ate. They talked about other things. Gerald the bird, who had apparently been replaced by a different bird who was less interesting. There's a book she'd started, a conversation he'd had with his sister that he mentioned briefly, and she didn't push on but filed away. Beneath the dinner and the conversation, Emily was quieter than usual. And Daniel noticed, and he let her be quiet, and he stayed later than he normally would without being asked to. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, sitting at her table, was that the dinner was not where it ended. It was where it began, because Emily had heard the comment at the library with her adult self Rational self, the self that knew exactly what she had with Daniel and knew it wasn't charity and knew it was real. There was another part of her, older, less articulate, or more deeply wired, that heard something different. The comment through the filter of every time she'd been told she needed too much, or leaned too hard, asked for more than she was entitled to, or didn't care about what was rational. That part had started talking. Over the next several days, it talked louder. She didn't tell Daniel. That was the thing. She'd told him the first wave, the initial hit, the dinner conversation, and she'd let him answer it. And she'd felt better in the moment, the way you feel better when someone you trust tells you the thing you need to hear. Comments hadn't stopped in her head just because he'd countered them. Underground, they kept working quietly. In the background, the way certain kinds of doubt do not announcing themselves, just reshaping things gradually from the inside. She started second-guessing the visits, dramatically, just hesitating at the door when she would have knocked before, or choosing to handle something herself instead of mentioning it to Daniel when she might have mentioned it the week before, answering his texts quickly, but not asking him to come by, the way she would have asked 2 weeks ago without thinking twice, noticed within 3 days. He was good at noticing her as much. And the absence of her knock had a texture to it, not just empty, but specifically shaped, the exact dimensions of the thing that wasn't happening. He gave it a week. He told himself she was busy, she was settling, people needed space. He was not going to be the person who crowded someone for needing a few days to themselves. He gave it a week, and then the week stretched into 10 days, and on the 11th day, he went to her door. She answered quickly. She looked fine, or looked like she looked fine, which he knew was different. Hey, she said, with a good smile. He said, you've been quiet. I've been busy, she said. Bedroom, I'm finally tackling it. Right, he said. Pause. You want to come in? She asked. Actually, he said, I want to ask you something first. She waited. Are we okay? He asked. Of course we're okay, Emily. She looked at him. And something shifted just slightly in the careful composure she'd been maintaining. Fine, she said. That word again, he said quietly. Her jaw tightened. She stopped, shook her head. In my head a little. It'll pass. It's nothing you did. I didn't ask if it was something I did, he said. I asked if we were okay. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised both of them. She stepped back from the door, not closing it, just moving back, and looked away. The kitchen window, where the jar was still sitting in the afternoon light. Her voice, when she spoke, was different, quieter, honest than she'd meant to be. I keep hearing that woman's voice, she said. My head, starting over alone, generous with his time. But I know it's stupid. I know it's not what we are. But she stopped. I don't want to be a burden to you. I don't want what we have to become, the thing she described. I don't always know where the line is between asking for company because I want it and asking for company because I'm afraid to be without it. Daniel was silent. The wind moved through the yard. Those aren't the same fear, he said finally. She looked at him. Being afraid of being alone is not the same as being dependent, he said. Having company is not the same as being a burden. You're running two different things together because someone who didn't know what she was talking about used the wrong words for something she didn't understand. He looked at her steadily. I need you to hear me say this, Emily, because I'm not going to keep watching you shrink the thing we have because someone at a library fundraiser misread it. She swallowed. Are not too much, he said. You have never been too much. And the fact that you're standing there in your own doorway, second-guessing whether you're allowed to want company that's not about me, about us. That's about something somebody did to you a long time ago. I'm sorry for it, but I am not going to let it win. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Just for a second, just the half second it takes to catch something before it escapes. Then she lowered her hand. When did you get so good at this? She said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. I'm not good at anything, he said. I'm just paying attention, like I always have been. She stood in the doorway. He stood on the porch, and then she took a step forward and did something she'd never done before. her arm around him. Not dramatically, not the full collapse of someone who's been holding on too long, just the quiet, deliberate kind of embrace. The kind that means I see you and I'm here in a language older than words. All on. Neither of them moved for a long moment. When she pulled back, she looked at him with an expression he hadn't quite seen on her face before. Something resolved. Something that had been tangled and was now beginning to come clear. Come in, she said. He came in. They didn't talk about the comments again that evening. They didn't need to, but something had shifted in her. In the careful architecture of self-protection she'd been quietly rebuilding around herself in those 10 days. He'd put his hand on it and held it still, and she'd let him. It was a thing she hadn't done in a very long time with anyone. Remember, she let him help her sort the back bedroom. It took 3 hours and ended with a pile for donation, a pile for keeping, and an argument about whether a lamp that looked like a disagreeable owl was charming or disturbing. Then he voted charming. Daniel voted disturbing. The lamp stayed. It was her house. He left at 9:30. She stood in the doorway and watched him go the same way. He always watched her go until he was inside, and the door was shut. She looked at the jar on the windowsill. She thought about what he'd said. You are not too much. You have never been too much. About the part of herself that had briefly and quietly tried to believe the woman at the library. The part that had started editing herself down, pulling herself smaller, pulling the visits and the knocking and the easy presence back to a safer, less exposed size. She thought about how much she didn't want to live there. That smaller size. Again, she turned off the kitchen light, put her to bed, and for the first time in 10 days, she didn't lie awake. But the neighborhood wasn't done. There had been more than one conversation at the gathering that Daniel hadn't heard, than one opinion making its way quietly through the social fabric of the street. And one of those opinions belonged to a woman who had known Daniel for 2 years, a neighbor, a person of genuine goodwill, who nonetheless had decided with complete confidence that she understood what was happening between the two of them better than they did. He was about to say so directly to Emily. And this time, Daniel wouldn't be there to catch it. Her name was Carol Whitman. She lived 4 houses down, had lived there for 11 years, and was the kind of woman who meant well in the specific way that made meaning well occasionally dangerous. Soup to sick neighbors. She remembered birthdays, the street's informal email chain that sent alerts about suspicious cars and lost cats, and whose recycling bins had blown into whose driveway. Remember, she was by every reasonable measure a good neighbor and a decent person. She had also decided, sometime around the 3rd week of October, she understood Daniel Carter better than Daniel Carter understood himself. Emily met her properly for the first time at the gathering, exchanged pleasantries, thought she seemed warm. She ran into her again at the cafe 2 weeks later, and Carol sat down with her coffee and said, "Do you mind if I join you?" in the way that meant she was already sitting. And Emily said, "Of course not." And they talked for 20 minutes about the neighborhood and the library and the particular misery of renovation projects. And it was genuinely pleasant. And then Carol set her cup down and said, "Look, with the careful warmth of someone who has been working up to something, can I ask you something? As someone who cares about Daniel." Emily felt the shift. The way the air in a room changes before something significant enters it. She said, "How are things between you two?" Carol asked. "Honestly." Emily looked at her. "We're friends, good friends." "I know," Carol said. "That's wonderful." "It really is. He needed that." Linda, he just closed down. Completely. It was hard to watch. She paused. "I've been watching the two of you, and I just want to make sure." She stopped. With her words, Daniel is a very generous man. He's the kind of person who gives without measuring. He doesn't know how to say no to someone who needs something. And I just want to make sure that what you have is balanced. The word landed like a stone in still water. Emily was very still. "Balanced," she said. "I don't mean that unkindly," Carol said quickly. You came here alone, and you've had a hard year from what I understand. And Daniel is the first person who opened his door to you, and those situations can become," she tilted her head, complicated. For both people, Emily put both hands flat on the table. About Daniel standing on her porch 11 days ago, saying, "You are not too much." About the 10 days she'd spent shrinking herself down because of a different woman's different version of this exact comment. About 12 years in a corporate world where every time she'd succeeded, someone nearby had found a quiet, polite way to suggest that her success was contingent on something outside herself. About all of that. And then she looked at Carol Whitman and said, very quietly, "What exactly do you think is happening between us?" Carol hesitated. "I think you've built a closeness very quickly. And I think Daniel, because of who he is, may be giving more than he realizes because he doesn't know how to protect himself from someone who she stopped again. Someone who needs him," Emily said. "I didn't say that." "You said it 3 different ways," Emily said. Her face was level, controlled. The voice of someone who has spent years learning to stay level when everything in her wanted to crack. You said balanced. You said complicated. You said he doesn't know how to say no. What you mean is you think I'm taking advantage of him." "Emily, I'm not angry," Emily said. And she wasn't not yet, not the hot kind. She was something colder and more precise. "I just want to be clear about what you're actually saying. Because I've found that when people say things in gentle language, it's easy to lose what they actually mean." Carol looked uncomfortable. "I mean it as a friend, to both of you." "With respect," Emily said, "you've known me for 20 minutes across 2 conversations. You don't know what I am to Daniel or what he is to me." She picked up her coffee. "And you don't know what I've given him. That's not something that happens in front of the neighborhood." She stood up. "Appreciate that you care about him," she said, and she meant it. "I promise you, I have spent a lot of my life being told that what I need is too much. I have spent a lot of my life making myself smaller so people around me would be more comfortable. I'm done doing that, and I'm not going to sit here and defend the most genuine thing in my life to someone who's only seen the outline of it." She picked up her coat. "Daniel," I said. "Hi," she said. "He'd want you to know we talked." She left. She walked 2 blocks before she stopped. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She thought they'd be shaking. All the right things. She'd stayed patrolled. She'd been honest without being cruel. By every measurable standard, she'd handled it exactly right. So why did she feel like she was falling? She knew why. She knew exactly why, and knowing it didn't help. Those Carol's words, no matter how neatly Emily he had dismantled them to her face, found the same crack that the first comments had found, same fracture line that ran through the center of every version of her self-confidence she'd ever built. Just the one that said, "What if they're right? What if you really are too much? What if Daniel is too kind to say it and everyone else can see what you can't?" She walked home. She did not go to Daniel's door. She went inside her own house, and she sat in the kitchen, and she looked at the jar on the windowsill, and she thought, "What have I built here? And is it real? And how would I know the difference?" She was still sitting there an hour later when her phone lit up. "Your light's on. You okay?" She looked at the message. She typed, "Fine. Long day." She stared at what she'd typed. She deleted it. She put her phone face down on the table and didn't answer. Daniel saw the 3 dots appear and disappear twice. Nothing. He waited 10 minutes. Then he put on his jacket. He knocked on her door and she answered, and he took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing serious," she said, Emily. "I ran into Carol Whitman," she said, for exactly 1 second. "What did she say?" "She was concerned about you," Emily said. "Whether things between us were balanced." Something moved across Daniel's face. It wasn't quite anger. It was the expression of a person who has just had a suspicion confirmed and is deciding what to do with the confirmation. "Come inside," she said. He came in. They stood in her kitchen, not sitting, both of them too tense for the ordinary mechanics of sitting down. "Well," Emily said first. "I know she did," Daniel said. "The part I care about." "Then what part do you care about?" "The part where it got to you," he said. "Where you sat in here for an hour and didn't answer my message because something she said is in your head and you're deciding what's true." Emily looked at him. You know, it's been an hour," she said. Because your light's been on and you haven't moved past that window since you got home, he said. I live 30 feet away, Emily. I pay attention. She put her hands over her face, not crying, just herself for a moment, the way you put your hand over something tender. I hate this, she said, muffled. I know, he said. Lowered her hands. I know she's wrong, she said. Here, I know what we have. I know it's not what she described. I keep. She pressed her lips together. Every time someone says it, some version of it, I believe it a little. I don't want to believe it, and I can't seem to stop. Daniel pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down, not standing over her, not making it a confrontation. Just sitting down and being at eye level, the way you do when you want to talk to someone and not at them. Done, he said. She sat. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said something she didn't expect. When Linda died, he said, kept telling me how strong I was for months. You're so strong, Daniel. You're handling this so well. Honors, Daniel. And every time someone said it, I felt like they were describing a person I didn't recognize. I didn't feel strong. I felt terrified. He looked at his hands. Terrified that if I stopped moving, stopped showing up and being useful, I'd have to actually sit with what happened. I built the routine, and the routine kept me functional. Like being functional felt enough like being okay that I let everyone keep calling it strong. Emily was watching him. There? And then you showed up, he said, with your jar and your onions and your printed out foundation article with the circled items. And he stopped. Exhaled, you made it impossible to stay in the routine. Because you were real. And being around someone real means you have to be real back, especially, and I wasn't sure I remembered how. She was very still. What I'm saying, he said, is that what Carol sees when she looks at us, this idea that you're the one being taken care of, and I'm the one doing the giving, that's backwards. But she's looking at the wrong half of it. He looked up. You've given me more than you know, and I need you to stop letting other people's version of this be louder than mine. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. Say it again, Emily said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Which part? The part where it's backwards, she said. He looked at her directly. You didn't come to me because you needed help, he said. You came to me because you were brave enough to need something and honest enough to go looking for it. It was never about sugar. It was about you deciding, even when it was hard, or even when you had to invent an excuse to make it feel safe, that you were worth the knock. She pressed her hand over her mouth again. Something escaped anyway, not dramatically. Kind of tears that come when something that has been held very tightly for a very long time is finally, carefully set down. She didn't apologize for them. He didn't tell her not to cry. He just sat across from her at her kitchen table and let her be a person having a real moment. She would think later one of the most loving things anyone had ever done for her. She pulled herself back together, which didn't take long. Emily Parker had excellent composure, even when composure was working against her. She looked at him across the table and said, "What are we doing, Daniel?" He held her gaze. "What do you mean?" he asked, though she thought he knew. I mean, she gestured between them. This, whatever this is. Because I've been very careful not to name it, and you've been very careful not to name it, and we've been careful together for months now. I think at some point, the careful starts to become its own kind of avoidance. He was quiet. I think, he said slowly, that I've known what this is for a long time. Then say it, she said. He looked at her, and then, without any preface, without any careful language or diplomatic framing, love you. I'm not saying that to fix what just happened. I'm saying it because it's been true for a while, and I'm done finding reasons not to. The air left the room. Emily sat with those words the way you sit with something enormous, not reacting immediately, being in the same space as it, feeling its dimensions. Love me, she said. Yes, he said. Since when? He thought about it genuinely. Since you showed up with a printed article and 3 items circled in red marker. But maybe before that. She almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a breath, a sound that happens when emotion doesn't know which direction to go. I love you too, she said. She said it the same way he had directly. Ceremony, the way you say something When you're done performing and done protecting and just want to tell the truth. Or he nodded, like he'd known, like he'd waited for the confirmation of something already established. He said. That's an insufferable thing to say, she told him. Probably, he agreed. She reached across the table. He met her halfway. They sat like that for a moment, hands on the table between them, on the windowsill, catching the light, the quiet house settling around them, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and also the most enormous. True things are always both at once. What do we do now, she asked. I think, he said, we stop being careful. Just like that, not just like that, he said. But rather, we've been building toward just like that for 6 months. This is the just like that at the end of a very long run-up. She looked at him. Really? Did you know that? People probably don't know you're funny, he said. She agreed. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Corners, and if the story had ended there at that kitchen table, those two words between them, hands in the middle, it would have been enough. Then enough. The kind of ending that earns its warmth. The story didn't end there, because the next morning, something happened that neither of them had anticipated, and it came not from the neighborhood, not from Carol Whitman or the two women at the party, from inside Daniel himself, from the place he'd been most careful about. Woke up at 6 a.m. the next morning, same as always, remembering the hour before the mind caught up, and he lay in bed and he thought about what he'd said at Emily's kitchen table. Love you. He had said it. He had meant it. He did not regret it. But in the 6 a.m. quiet of his house, with the particular clarity that comes in the first minutes of the day before the world gets loud, he felt something else alongside the warmth of last night. Something that lived deeper than the warmth, older than it. There's something that had been there for 3 years and did not go away simply because it had been joined by something new. Afraid. Not afraid of Emily. Not afraid of what they'd said. Afraid of the specific thing that happened the last time he'd loved someone, which was that she left. By choice. Not cruelly. Not in any way that could be blamed or prevented. There's just the fundamental randomness of living, which does not consult your feelings before making its decisions, and which had taken Linda on a Tuesday in March 3 years ago and left Daniel standing in a hospital corridor, trying to understand how the world had continued to exist. Up. He made coffee. He stood at the window and looked at the garden. I am afraid. He thought, I have been afraid this whole time. The routine, the distance, the helpful ghost, all of it was afraid. And I said it anyway. He thought about what Rachel had said on the phone that Saturday. Is she good to you? And his answer, yeah, she is. And Rachel saying, well, stop talking to me about it and go figure it out. What about Linda saying, the door has to open from the inside? He stood at the window for a long time, and then he picked up his phone and called Rachel. It's 6 a.m, she said when she answered. Told her, he said, silence. Then you told her. Last night, I loved her. And she said it back. Another silence. Daniel, Rachel said. And her voice had shifted softer now. Way it got when she was being his sister rather than his interlocutor. I'm scared, he said. Flat, plain, no decoration. I know, she said. I don't know how to do this and not be scared of losing it. Nobody does, she said. A flaw. That's just what loving someone costs. A pause. You know what Linda used to say about you? He went still. Rachel almost never referenced Linda directly. She used to say, Rachel continued, carefully, that you were the bravest person she'd ever met. That you were brave in the wrong. You'd run into a burning building without thinking. But asking for what you needed that terrified you. He didn't say anything. She'd want this for you, Rachel said. She would be absolutely furious with you for taking 3 years to get here. Colders, and she would want this. He pressed the phone against his ear and looked out at the garden. Rosemary bush was still there, still doing aggressively well. Oh, he said. Then hold on to it, Rachel said. Whatever it costs. Hold on to it. He put the phone down. He finished his coffee. He got dressed. And at 8:15 earlier than he'd normally go over, earlier than either of them, had established as a natural hour for knocking on each other's doors. He walked across the yard and knocked on Emily's door. She answered in 10 seconds. She was already dressed, already holding a mug, and she looked at him when she opened the door with an expression that said she'd been awake for a while and possibly thinking the same things he'd been thinking. Hi, she said. Hi, he said, a beat. You okay? She asked. Sitting there, he said. She stepped back. He came in at her kitchen table again. The same table, hers. The morning light different from the evening light, their jar still on the windowsill, exactly where it had been. Ordered him coffee without asking. He took it without thanking her, which was the language of people who are past the performance of courtesy and into something more real. Woke up scared, he said. She looked at him. Me too. Yeah, I woke up at 5:30, she said. Lay there for an hour arguing with myself about whether what I felt last night was real or whether it was just the moment, the emotion of it. Whether in the morning it would look different. Does it? He asked. Looked at him directly. No, she said. It looks exactly the same. He exhaled something he'd been holding since 6A. I'm not good at this, he said. I need you to know that. I was good at being married. I was good at that specific thing with that specific person. But this starting over, doing the early part again, the part where you're still figuring out how another person works. I haven't done this in 20 years. I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. I'm going to get it wrong constantly, Emily said. I am much better at corporate strategy than I am at being a person in someone's life. Overthink. I withdraw when I should talk. I have an above-average tendency to handle things myself and then be inexplicably upset when no one noticed. I know, he said. I've noticed. She pointed at him. That's the thing. You notice, do you know how disarming that is to someone who spent years being invisible? You were never invisible, he said. I was extremely invisible, she said. In a room full of people all talking about themselves, I was the person in the corner, making sure the presentation was right. She wrapped her hands around her mug. So good at being useful and so bad at being seen. I see you, he said. Oh. She looked at him. I know, she said, softly. They sat with that for a moment. The morning around them, coffee between them, everything said, and not rushed, and not overstated, and exactly what it needed to be. Can I ask you something? Emily said yes. The first night, she said. I showed up with the jar. What did you actually think? He considered it. You were someone who'd run out of sugar, he said. After the second visit, I thought you were someone who needed a screwdriver. And after the third, he looked at her. You were someone who kept coming back. And I thought without quite letting myself finish the thought that I didn't mind. You didn't mind, she repeated. More than didn't mind, he said. But I wasn't ready to say that yet. When did you get ready? He thought about the 8th visit. I'm without the jar. The tea on the porch. The hour that stretched past the point of any reasonable excuse. When you came over without the jar, he said. When you knocked just because you wanted to. That was the one. She was quiet. That was the hardest one, she admitted. Outside for 5 minutes. I almost went back inside. I'm glad you didn't, he said. Well, am I, she said. And just like that quietly, ceremony, in the morning light of her kitchen, with coffee, and the jar, and the particular subtle feeling of two people who have found their way to the same place by very different routes, something was established. Announced, not celebrated, not yet, just established. Real and acknowledged and solid beneath them, but the world outside that kitchen had not stopped moving. In that world, Carol Whitman had told 2 people about her conversation with Emily. And those 2 people had, in the very human way of things, each told one other person. And the story that traveled between those tellings was not the story of what had actually been said. It was the simpler, more dramatic version, the one that emerged when you summarize something complicated in a single sentence. And the simplified version, by the time it made one full circuit of the neighborhood's informal network, was this, that Emily Parker had confronted Carol Whitman in a cafe and told her to mind her own business. Only half true. But half true is enough to build a story on a neighborhood where stories travel by instinct. And Daniel, who had no idea any of this was moving, was about to find out not from Carol, not from the neighborhood, but from Gary, who appeared at his gate 3 days later with the specific expression of a man delivering information he's been sitting on and can no longer contain. Your neighbor, Gary said. Daniel looked up from the garden. Really? He said. She had words with Carol Whitman, Gary said. Cafe. People are talking. Daniel set down the trowel. Kind of talking, he said. The kind that takes sides, Gary said, with the expression of a man who is trying to stay neutral and clearly has a side. Half the street thinks Carol overstepped. The other half thinks he paused. You know how people are. What does the other half think? Daniel asked. Very evenly. Gary looked uncomfortable. They think Emily got defensive because Carol touched on something true. Daniel stood up fully. And what do you think? He asked. Gary met his eyes. I think, he said carefully, that Carol has known you for 2 years and Emily for 20 minutes. And that counts for something. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. He said with respect. And I mean that I do you and the rest of the street have seen 20% of what this is. Us? The outside 20. What's actually between Emily and me isn't neighborhood business. He picked up the trowel. I'm going to ask you to please let Carol know that. Gary nodded. He looked slightly chastened. She means well, he said. Her means well, Daniel said. That's not always enough. Gary went home. Daniel stood in the garden. He thought, this is the part where it gets tested. By the hard things, not by grief or loss or the particular violence of the unexpected. By the small, persistent friction of being two people in the world where the world has opinions and the opinions have weight and the people who love you are sometimes the ones most likely to get between you and what you need about what to do. And then he did the thing he'd been learning across 6 months of glass jars and borrowed moments in evening conversations that went later than planned. Inside, he called Emily. She answered on the second ring. About Gary, she said immediately. I heard about Carol, he said. Are you mad? She asked. About Carol? No, he said. The story that got made out of it? A little. I handled it wrong, she said. I should have been less direct. You were exactly right, he said. Honest, and you were fair, and you defended something worth defending. He paused. Proud of you. Silence on her end. Don't make me cry before 9 in the morning, she said. Then 15, he said. Daniel, come over, he said. Make breakfast. Real breakfast. Not tea and cookies. You cook? I was a firefighter for 18 years, he said. Cook. For 20 people. Before 6 a.m. Yes, I cook. She came over 20 minutes later. He made eggs and toast and actual coffee, and they sat at his kitchen table, this time not hers. And for the first time in all the months of this, she sat in his house in the morning like it was a natural place to be. Like the kitchen table was already half hers. Like neither of them had to make space for the other because space had already been made. Car was still on the shelf behind him. The one she'd left weeks ago and never reclaimed, and that he'd never moved. She glanced at it while he poured coffee. You still have that, she said. Told you, he said. It stays. She looked at it. She looked at him. I'm not sorry I said what I said to Carol, she said. I want you to know, I wasn't just defending myself. Defending us. He set the coffee down, I know, he said. We're worth defending, she said. He looked at her across his own kitchen table. In the morning light, with the jar on the shelf and the eggs on the stove and the entire specific weight of everything they'd built sitting between them, ordinary and enormous and entirely, irrevocably real. Yeah, he said, we are. The breakfast at Daniel's kitchen table became a habit, announced, not scheduled, just the natural continuation of a thing already in motion. The way water doesn't decide to run downhill. It simply does, because the ground beneath it has already made the decision. Emily started appearing at his door on Saturday mornings, without the jar, an excuse, without any pretense at all. Just herself, in whatever she'd put on that morning, knocking twice the way she always knocked, and he'd already have the eggs out because he'd heard her door close from across the yard, and he knew. It was the thing neither of them talked about directly, but both of them felt precisely he knew her sounds now. The specific sound of her door, the particular rhythm of her footsteps on the porch steps. Her knock was always twice, never 3 times, or once. Small and specific and entirely hers, the way the details of a person become yours when you've been paying attention long enough. She knew his too. She knew he was awake by the time his kitchen light came on. Coffee was always before 6. She knew that if she texted him before 7, he'd answer within 2 minutes because he'd been up for an hour already. She knew that when he went quiet in conversation, it didn't mean he was done. It meant he was thinking. Actually thinking the way people do when they're not filling silence with noise, but actually moving through something. They had learned each other. That was the plain fact of it. In the way that takes time and attention and the willingness to keep showing up, they had learned each other. The neighborhood had mostly settled. The brief social weather system generated by Carol's conversation and its subsequent orbit around the street had dissipated the way those things do, replaced by the next small drama, the next piece of news, the next thing to notice and discuss. Carol herself had said nothing directly to either of them since. She sent a brief email to Emily through the neighborhood chain about a community cleanup event, entirely normal, and Emily replied in kind. That was that. No apology, no confrontation, just two adults letting something pass because making peace is more useful than making a point. I respected that. He told Emily so. I'm not gracious, she said, correcting him. I'm pragmatic. There's a difference. She sent you an olive branch the size of a community event email, he said. Sippy. And you took it. That's gracious. That's efficiency, Emily said. I don't have the energy for ongoing conflict with someone who lives 4 houses down. Sure, Daniel said. A tone that meant he disagreed, and she knew it, and they were both going to leave it there. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. That was November. Arrived with the specific cold of Oregon. Winter's not brutal, but persistent, the kind of cold that lives in the bones of old houses and makes every room a negotiation between the thermostat and the draft. Emily's house, as old as it was and as much as she'd repaired it, had places where winter crept in around the edges. Upstairs windows needed resealing. The heating vent in the back bedroom was partly blocked by something she couldn't identify. And Daniel eventually had to get into the ceiling to find out it was a bird's nest. Gerald had both decided, or one of Gerald's relatives, living rent-free in the infrastructure. Daniel spent 2 Saturdays in December working on Emily's upstairs windows while she worked alongside him, learning the technique rather than simply handing him things. It was a thing she'd made clear early on. She didn't want to be handed a finished product. She wanted to understand the process. She wanted to be able to do it herself next time. Liked that about her. He'd liked it from the beginning, even when he hadn't been honest about what he liked and what it meant. This, he said, one afternoon, pressing the seal into the corner of the frame. She pressed. Keep the pressure even, he said. Don't let it gap in the middle. I'm not letting it gap, she said. It's gapping in the middle. It's not gapping. He leaned past her to look. Like gapping. She made a sound of profound exasperation. He laughed. She maintained her pressure and did not gap the seal. Assessment. Despite his assessment, and when they stepped back and looked at the finished window, she said, what was I saying? You were saying it wasn't gapping, he said. It was correct, she said. You were correct, he agreed. She looked at the window. He looked at her, looking at the window. And somewhere in that ordinary, unsexy, fairly domestic moment, winter light, compound, the faint smell of his jacket and whatever she'd been cooking downstairs that was making the whole house warm. Daniel felt something settle in him so completely and so quietly that he almost didn't notice it. 3 years of waiting for the ground to feel solid again. Solid, unremarkable, real. Christmas came, and with it something neither of them had discussed, but both had been privately navigating the question of what the holiday meant when you were two people somewhere between new and established, just friends, and the thing they'd named to each other at her kitchen table in October and been living out loud every day since. Rachel called to invite Daniel to Boise for Christmas. Told her he wasn't coming this year. There was a pause on the phone. Of Emily. Because of Emily, he confirmed. She's staying here too? Her family's in Phoenix, he said. Her sister, 2 nephews. She's flying down December 23rd and back the 26th. So you'll be alone for Christmas, Rachel said. They're 2 days, he said. And then she'll be back. Another pause. During the days. I'm aware of the schedule, he said. Carter, Rachel said. and he could hear the smile, are absolutely counting the days. He said nothing. Like her, Rachel said. I haven't met her and I like her. Tell her that. I'm not telling her that, he said. And tell her yourself when you meet her. When am I meeting her? Soon, he said. More quietly, I want you to. A beat. Good, Rachel said. Softly, he spent the 2 days of Emily's absence in a way that would have been indistinguishable from his pre-Emily routine to any outside observer garden. Coffee, the quiet house, the early mornings. But the texture of it was different. It was different. It was the quiet of someone who knows the absence is temporary, which is an entirely different animal from the quiet of someone who has stopped expecting presence at all. Uttered her once each day. Brief. Nothing requiring much in return. Or the nephews. Loud, she replied. Perfect. Wish you could meet them. Herbert. He read that last sentence 3 times. Wish you could meet them. He put the phone down and looked at the jar on the shelf and felt something warm move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She came back on the 26th, as promised. Her flight landed at 4 in the afternoon. She texted him from the car, home in 45. He had dinner ready when she knocked. Elaborate pasta, the good kind, the recipe he'd made once before, and she'd said without thinking, this is the best thing I've eaten in months, and then looked embarrassed about saying it, which was how he'd known. She meant it. When she came in and saw the table set and the pasta on the stove, she stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the food. She looked at him. She set her bag down on the floor. She said. You were traveling, he said. Sit down. She didn't sit down. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, the way she had on the porch in October. The quiet, deliberate kind, not dramatic, just entirely real. And she held on for a moment, and he held on back. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the holding didn't already cover. I missed you, she said into his shoulder. I know, he said. I hate that I missed you this much in 3 days, she said. I missed you too, he said. She pulled back and looked at him. They're not going to say you hate it? No, he said. She studied his face. You're okay with it, she said. A question. I'm more than okay with it, he said. Just sit down. The pasta's going to overcook. She sat down. He served. They ate across his kitchen table in the December evening, and she told him about the nephews, 5 and 8, the younger one obsessed with dinosaurs, and the older one currently in an impenetrable phase of monosyllabic responses to every adult question, and her sister, who was the more organized and decisive of the two of them and had spent the entire visit gently suggesting that Emily's new life sounded very nice in the tone that meant she wanted details Emily wasn't providing. Tell her about me? Daniel asked. Emily took a sip of water. I had a very good neighbor, she said. Very good neighbor, he repeated. Who had become important, she added. Significantly important, she said. Her eyes on her pasta, Emily. She looked up. I was happy, she said simply. And she asked why, and I said your name. I just said your name. And she knew. There's no. He looked at her. What did she say? He asked. She said, is he kind, Emily said. And I said, yes. She met his eyes. Well, I said, the kindest person I've met in a long time. And she says that was the only thing that mattered. The kitchen was quiet. Right, Daniel said. Emily smiled. She usually is. It's insufferable. He laughed. She laughed. And that was Christmas. January brought cold and a decision not discussed in advance. Not build into anything deliberately. Just the natural arrival of something that had been inevitable for long enough that, when it appeared, less like a choice and more like an acknowledgement. Melanie came over on a Sunday morning, as she always did now on Sundays. She sat at his kitchen table with her coffee. He sat across from her with his. They were reading. She had a book. He had the newspaper. Comfortable parallel cell silence of two people who had moved past needing to fill every moment with conversation. And then she looked up from her book and said, I've been thinking about the back bedroom. He looked up from the newspaper. Gerald's former residence. After Gerald was evicted, she confirmed. Empty. Since. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it. She paused. I was thinking about turning it into a proper guest room. That makes sense, he said. Or an office. For me. If I start consulting again. A pause. Or she stopped. He waited. You could use it, she said. Sure. If you needed a space, for whatever you need a space for. He set the newspaper down. She was looking at her book, but she wasn't reading it. A space, he said. A space, she confirmed. I'm not saying anything dramatic. I'm saying there's a room. And you're here enough that it seems practical. A space that's yours. He looked at her for a long moment. Emily, he said. She looked up. Is this your version of asking me something, he asked. Was. Maybe, she said. Then say the actual thing, he said. You've earned the actual thing. You don't need to come at it sideways. She held his gaze. I want you here more, she said. Not some of the time. Because of it. I want to know that when I come home, you're close. She exhaled. I want what we have to live somewhere real. Split between 2 houses and 30 feet of yard. The word landed the way true things land, not with drama, but with weight. Solid and clear and impossible to misread. He said. She blinked. Okay? Okay, he said again. She stared at him. You're not going to think about it? I've been thinking about it for 2 months, he said. I was waiting for you to say it. You were waiting. She set her book down. You knew I was working up to this? You reorganized your storage room twice, he said. You measured the back bedroom 3 separate times when you thought I wasn't looking. You replaced the lock on the front door with a deadbolt that has a key code instead of a regular key. He looked at her steadily. I'll notice things, Emily. I've told you this multiple times. She stared at him. The lock was for security, she said. The lock was so you could give me a code, he said. Opened. Closed. You are the most observant person I have ever met, she said finally. And it is deeply, deeply unfair. Do you want me to say yes or not? He asked. She said immediately. Yes, obviously yes. Then yes, he said. At him. He looked at her, and then she burst out laughing, the real one, the full-body one, the one that had surprised her the first time it happened in his kitchen, and that now happened easily. And often, a laugh that meant she was genuinely happy, rather than performing happiness for a room full of people who weren't looking closely enough to tell the difference. Across from her, and felt the particular warmth of someone else's real laugh at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning. This is the thing. This exact thing is the thing Linda was talking about. It has to open from the inside. He had opened it, fully, completely, and everything that mattered had walked right in. The next twist came quietly, as the most significant ones always did. It was a Wednesday in February. Emily was at Daniel's house, which had started to feel less like his house and more like their house, in the soft and accumulating way of things that shift without announcement, and she was on the phone with her sister while Daniel was in the other room. He wasn't listening. He was doing his own thing, reading, half present in the way of someone comfortable enough in a shared space to be somewhere else in his head. Then he heard Emily's voice change, not dramatically, just a shift in register, lower, more careful. He looked up. Are you back? Emily said into the phone. Yeah, fine. I'll call you back. She came into the room. She sat down. She looked at him with an expression he knew, but hadn't seen in a while, the controlled version she used when something was significant and she was deciding how to carry it. My sister, she said, just told me that my old company is restructuring. They're looking for someone to lead the new division. She paused. Told her to find me because they couldn't reach me directly. Another pause. Job is in Seattle. The room was quiet. Daniel looked at her. Job, he said. Senior VP level, she said. The thing I spent 12 years working toward. She pressed her hands together. The exact thing I walked away from. Why'd you walk away from it? He asked. I was miserable, she said. Are you miserable now? He said. At him. No. Then why are we talking about Seattle? He said. Quiet. Because it's the job, she said. The one I planned for. I built a career to get to. And they're offering it to me now. Or I stopped planning for it. And I don't know what that means. She looked at her hands. I don't know if it means I should take it, or if it means I should know definitively why I'm not taking it. Or if I'm not taking it, or if she stopped. I'm spiraling. I know, he said. Up. She looked at him. Do you want the job? He asked. Silence. A year ago, she said slowly, I would have said yes before you finished the sentence. And now? She held his gaze. Not what I have now, she said. I want this. But I also don't know who I am if I'm not working towards something. I left Seattle because I was running from something. I'm going to stay here because I'm hiding from something. He understood immediately why she was scared of losing the job, of losing herself, of waking up in 5 years having made the right emotional choice and the wrong professional one, of discovering that what she'd built here was built partially on the foundation of something she was avoiding rather than something she'd genuinely chosen. It was right to sit with it. He said, "What would you do here?" "If you stay, consult," she said. "I've been thinking about it for months. Independent work. I could build a client base. It would take time. It's not the VP role." "No," he said. "Is the VP role what you actually want? Or is it what you're supposed to want because you spent 12 years wanting it?" She stared at him. "I hate that question," she said. "I know," he said. "A very good question," she said. "I know that too." She was quiet for a long moment. "Better be quiet." He was good at that. "If I were being honest," she said finally, "the thing that excited me about the job wasn't the job. It was the idea that I was still wanted, that the time I put in meant something. That leaving didn't mean being erased." "You haven't been erased," he said. "Oh," she said. "I know that here." She touched her chest. "But there is a part of me that needed to hear it." "You've heard it," he said. "Is it enough?" She looked at him. "You're asking me to choose," she said. "I'm not asking you to choose anything," he said. "I'm asking you what you want. What you actually want, not what you planned, not what proves something. What you want." A long silence. "I want to stay," she said, "here with you. And I want to build the consulting work because it excites me, not because it's safe, and I want to call them back and say thank you and no." She exhaled. "I want to stop being afraid that staying is the easier choice." "Staying isn't easier," he said. "Staying is braver." She looked at him. "Say that again," she said. "Heard me," he said. "Daniel, staying takes more courage than leaving," he said. "All right, you know that. That's why you're scared of it." She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. "I'm just holding something." "Okay," she said. "Hey?" he asked. "I'm calling them back and saying no," she said. "And then I'm not talking about Seattle again." "You can talk about Seattle as much as you need to," he said. "Me too," she said. "I'm done." She picked up her phone. Her sister back. She said, "Tell them thank you. Tell them I've built something here that I'm not willing to leave." A pause. I'm sure another pause. "Yes, that kind of something." She glanced at Daniel. "His name is Daniel. Yes, I'll bring him to visit." A pause. "Love you too." She hung up. She set the phone on the table. Look at Daniel. "You're coming to Phoenix," she said. "Hi," he said. "Apparently," she said. "My sister is expecting it." "When did I agree to this?" he said. "Now, technically," she said. "When you didn't say no." He looked at her. Looked at him. "Fine," he said. She smiled. "The real one." "Good," she said. Spring came. The garden woke up the way it always did, incrementally. Announcement, the way things begin when they're ready, rather than when you expect them. Daniel's tomatoes went back in the ground. The lavender came back on its own. Rosemary bush, defying all logic and expectation, was doing better than ever. He told Emily this with the specific pride of a man who had been gardening alone for 3 years and had someone to tell now. "Harold's family probably fertilized it," she said. "That's disgusting," he said. "Nature is practical," she said. She had flowers in her backyard on a Saturday in April. Because either of them had planned it, it started because she had seeds she'd bought impulsively at the hardware store in March and hadn't known what to do with them. Well, somehow that turned into both of them in her backyard with their hands in the dirt, arguing pleasantly about spacing and whether lavender would work in that corner or whether she needed something with more shade tolerance. Peter was on his knees, adjusting a seedling when Emily said, "I don't know where. Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" "The first." He thought about it. The door. The jar. Apologetic laugh. "Sure," he said. She looked at her. "You said sure. You asked if you could borrow sugar," he said. "It seemed like the right word." "It's a very non-committal word," she said. "There was a non-committal man," he said. "And now," she said, at her. Dirt on his hands. Spring sun. The garden they were building together in the yard of a house that had been hers. and was slowly becoming both of theirs. Things become shared when two lives start to lean into each other. Remembers now, he said, I'm a man who knows what he wants. She held his gaze. What do you want? She asked. Not teasing, asking. Or Baffigs. He looked at her the way the man in the photograph had looked at the woman, the one Emily had found in the storage room. Strangers from someone else's life. The image she'd put in a shoebox because it moved her in a way she hadn't been ready to name. The way that meant you, specifically. Not someone. He said, you, the garden, the Saturday mornings, on the shelf, Gerald's descendants in the rosemary. He paused. All of it. She was quiet for a moment. Even the owl lamp? She said, owl lamp is disturbing and will always be disturbing, he said. Nurse, she said. I know it stays, he said. He laughed. He smiled. She went back to planting. And somewhere in the ordinary miracle of that afternoon, two people in a garden, the earth, the complicated and quiet and entirely genuine story of how they'd found each other, woven through every seedling and every spoken thing and every silence between them, the last of the careful distance dissolved, dramatically, not with ceremony, just gone, replaced by something better. There is a glass jar on the kitchen shelf. It has been there for almost a year. It is as an excuse and became a symbol and is now simply a thing that belongs in that kitchen, that shelf between those two people, which is how the best things tend to end up. Not chosen with great deliberation, just placed somewhere and left there because moving it would mean losing the particular truth it holds. Emily stopped borrowing sugar the day she admitted she never needed it. Daniel stopped opening his door on obligation the day he understood it had never been obligation. They built afterward was not perfect. They argued sometimes about the owl lamp and the thermostat, and once, at some length, about the correct way to load a dishwasher, a conversation that ended with neither of them conceding, and both of them laughing too hard to keep fighting. Harder moments, too. Days when Daniel went quiet in the way that meant Linda and Emily knew to leave him the space, and he came back from it when he was ready. Days when Emily's old fears surfaced too much, too needy, too loud in someone else's life, and Daniel sat with her in them until they passed, minimizing and not solving, just staying. That was the thing nobody told you about love the second time around. But it wasn't easier, but it was steadier, because you knew things the first time hadn't taught you that it ends sometimes, that the door being open doesn't guarantee the weather outside. And knowing those things and opening the door anyway was an entirely different kind of love. More deliberate, more chosen, more real, in the specific way that things are real when you've already lived the alternative. One morning in late spring, Gary stopped Daniel on the sidewalk again. A neighbor of yours, Gary said. Then he caught himself. Really? What about her? Daniel said. Gary looked at him for a moment. You look different, Gary said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. How? Gary considered it. Like your home, he said. Daniel looked at the house. His house. Her house. Their house. Depending on the morning. And where they decided to have coffee and who had started dinner. Her, he said. Good, Gary said with a nod that meant something more than the word. Her. And then he walked on. And Daniel stood on the sidewalk and felt beneath the ordinary morning and the spring air and the sound of the neighborhood doing what neighborhoods do, the specific and unrepeatable truth of where he was. He was 42 years old. He had built a good life once and lost it and been afraid for 3 years to want another. He had kept his door closed and his routines tight and his distance carefully maintained. And then a woman had showed up with a glass jar and a bad excuse and the quiet courage of someone who had decided, against her better judgment, to knock anyway. And he had opened the door. Nothing had been the same since. He went inside. He made coffee. He looked at the jar on the shelf and understood, finally and completely, what Emily had meant all those months ago when she said this feels safer. She hadn't meant the jar. She hadn't meant the sugar or the excuse or the careful approach sideways to the things she actually wanted. She had meant you. She had meant being near you feels like the safest I've been in a long time. She had meant the thing people mean when they can't say the thing directly, and so they find the smallest, most ordinary object in their kitchen and carry it across a yard as a way of saying, I choose you. I'm just not ready to say it yet. He had understood it then, somewhere beneath the surface. He understood it fully now. He picked up his phone and sent her a message. Coffee's ready. I came in 45 seconds. On my way. He set the phone down. He poured 2 cups. He heard her door close from across the yard. Always 2. He opened the door. She was standing on his porch in the spring morning. No jar, no excuse. Just herself, 35 years old and starting over and braver than she knew, and entirely, permanently his. And she looked at him the way she always looked at him. Like she was glad the door was open, and gladder still that he was the one standing behind it. She said. Good morning, he said. She came in. He closed the door behind her, and that was the whole of it. Because the truth neither of them had expected, and both of them had needed, that sometimes the smallest excuse creates the biggest change. Sometimes a borrowed cup of sugar is never about sugar at all. And that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is carry an empty jar across a yard and knock twice and wait to see if someone will open the door. He had spent 3 years learning to keep his door closed. Emily Parker had spent 6 months finding the courage to knock. He opened it, really opened it, all the way, protection, and without distance, and without the careful armor of a man who had decided not to want things anymore. That was the moment both of them, finally, irrevocably, came home.